We've had passwords for decades, but how are you going to fix the password? We've been asking for uppercase, lowercase, numbers, special characters, rotating them every 90 days. But the reality is, passwords are the original sin of cybersecurity. So we're going to bring an expert on to talk to you about how to fix that right after this. Hello and welcome to another episode of CISO Tradecraft, the podcast that provides you with the information, knowledge, and wisdom to be a more effective cybersecurity leader. My name is Hardy. I am your host for today, and I have Nishant Kaushik from the FIDO Alliance, the Chief Technology Officer, to give us some great ideas on identity-based security. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to have this conversation.
So, as I mentioned about passwords and things like that, we've done that for a long time. And as I try to tell people, I think if I remember right, the whole idea of 8 uppercase, lowercase numbers, special characters, etc., was to create a certain amount of entropy, a sample space, that an old PDP-8 would take about 60 days to try every possibility. So we shortened it to 30 and said, there we go. So we've got like a 1977 standard of why we should do passwords. And of course, humans don't think in uppercase, lowercase numbers, and special characters and stuff like that. And we realize that even if you try to work on that, it's still a broken model to begin with. And so as a result, we find out that people steal credentials and identity is the new perimeter. So I guess before we get into the technical talk, let's talk a little bit about you and your work that you're doing over there at the FIDO Alliance. Tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, I'm Nishant I'm the CTO at the FIDO Alliance, right? But the FIDO Alliance is essentially a large industry consortium, almost 300 members, or maybe over 300 members at this point, ranging from the large platform providers like Google, Apple, Microsoft, all the way down to small startups. And they're all coming together to really focus on enabling secure, simple digital experiences online. And it started with, as you said, the original sin, tackling the problem of passwords. And that's the first challenge that the FIDO Alliance set out to solve, which is how do we get rid of passwords? Not improve passwords, not change passwords, but just get rid of them. What is the alternative? And really what it boiled down to is the alternative has been there all along. It's cryptography and cryptographic-based authentication. And we've had PKI for a long time. So it's not that it's anything new. What they really set out to solve was how do we bring it to the masses? How do we make it mass available so it's not a niche thing, but can be used by anybody, whoever, whether they're in the workforce or they're consumers?
Interesting. So first of all, let's talk about FIDO, FIDO. What does that stand for?
FIDO stands for Fast Identity Online. The keyword being fast, right? Because it's not
Right.
just about logging in, it's about logging in quickly and securely, because security doesn't work if everybody wants to get around it.
So as I mentioned, if identity is our new perimeter, and then the concern that we had about people stealing identity, so you can set up a zero trust network and we say you can encrypt everything, you can authenticate everything, and technologically you're all set. But if somebody steals an identity because they had a password or whatever, and in they go, that whole secure network is built to protect the attacker. And now you can't tell what the attacker is doing. So I think what's happening is as we look at these high profile credential stuffing attacks where somebody grabs stuff and they try to get in there, what's actually involved in a credential stuffing attack, first of all? And then typically, why do passwords make us vulnerable to that?
So credential stuffing attacks typically are the idea of building a script that will just rotate through a whole bunch of passwords as a way of seeing which one works best, which one actually manages to get through. And credential stuffing attacks usually work because systems have been designed to not really lock a user out if they make incorrect attempts. So it does rely on the fact that the systems are being designed for human beings who make mistakes, who forget, or who will sometimes forget whether it's an uppercase A or a lowercase a and stuff like that. And so really that's what credential stuffing attacks are trying to exploit, is just the idea, I'll just try a whole bunch of different passwords and see which one gets me in. I think the systems, the attacks have actually gotten more sophisticated over time, right? Now, because now you don't even have to try credential stuffing because that's guesswork. Now you're more sophisticated. You can capture the password using phishing attacks, or you can find the passwords from password breach databases that exist. Have you been found is a great
Mhm.
resource for folks just to see how much trouble are you in, really. So the attack vectors have changed dramatically. And as you pointed out earlier, we really haven't kept up with that if by still sticking with an old system like passwords.
Yeah, so if we take a look at it, we think about, okay, what do we do instead of a password? Now, there are other ways, and you can, as they say, if you had to build on that shaky foundation of a password, what I tell people is use a passphrase. So I used to teach a lot of cybersecurity, and I'd say, use something like the little girl went to the store to buy some food for her cat. Something that long, NSA is not going to be able to crack that because there's just so many permutations. It's 14 moves into a chess game. There's going to be just an astronomical number of potential positions. And humans think in stories because we don't think in, as I said, these special representations. However, comma, most people tend to be lazy and they will pick a song verse or a something out of a poem, or they just read whatever's on the wall and type it in there, and off it goes. So again, humans are a really bad source of entropy. We don't do a good job of coming up with truly random stuff. So as we're getting to the point where we're saying, okay, we get that, identity is a perimeter. Humans are a bad choice of entropy, yet we're letting humans pick passwords that become our perimeter, which by definition means that we now have problems. We want to shift over to something different. Have you seen the evolution of these non password approaches? Did they start with consumers? Did they start with corporate and enterprise solutions? What's been our history to bring us up until now? And then we'll talk about the way forward.
I think we've seen the evolution, as I said earlier, in niche places, right? Especially in highly sensitive operations. Folks have been eliminating passwords for a long time in favor of tokens or a dongle that you carry around with you or a card that you can plug in. So using a smart card or something like that. Clearly, from the, as you mentioned, as a way of getting it out of the loop of the human having to remember something that they're not going to write down and stick on a sticky note on their monitor and things like that. The usual problem. I think
There we
it's
go.
also
Got my sticky notes here waiting for passwords.
yeah, the bane of every security presentation, right? And so those modalities have existed for a while now. But like I said, they're expensive to deploy and they've required for a long time special, not just specialized hardware, but also specialized software on the back end, complex integrations and things like that. And that the dimensions of the problems also changed once we went from having three systems, maybe five systems you had to log into now hundreds that we log into as part of our job, as part of our life. It really has outgrown those modalities over time. And where it went to after that, I think, is it started saying passwords on their own are not good enough. So what do we add on to it? So that's where MFA came in. And we started doing multi-factor authentication.
So let's talk a little bit about MFA, an authentication factor. So there are, they used to be say three, but I'll say there's four authentication factors. Something you know, like a password. Something I am, like a biometric. Okay. Something I have, my little key and things like that. Then I put that. But then I will add a fourth one, which is we can now do this effectively someplace I am, where I can geofence things. I can
Mhm.
say, wait a minute, you're trying to log into your bank account, but you're showing that you're in East Europe instead of Ohio, for example. And so I can say, yeah, I'm not okay with that. Are there any other more practical authentication factors that we could think of? Or does that cover the
I think those cover the majority of factor, what I would say, characteristics, if you will, right? Within them, you have different, right? So biometrics, as you said, there's different types of biometrics. There's fingerprint, there's face, etc., voice.
Mhm.
When you start talking about something you are, we saw this evolution where people started bringing in things like behavioral biometrics, which is how do you type? What is your typing pattern? When do you log in? How do you log in? The when do you log in? How do you log in? Typically starts to bleed into the fourth one that you're bringing up, which is things like geofencing. What kind of device are you on? At what time of day do you log in? Is that behavioral? Is that something else? All of those start being baked in. And at the end of the day, what it basically boils down to is it's all a guessing game. you're trying to make a guess, a best estimation of, is this really the same user logging in again and again and again, based on some scoring that you may think of that you're trying to do.
Yeah, because I remember I had a bank, I won't mention their name, it's a pretty large one, that their first efforts at multi-factor authentication weren't right. What you had to have a username, which was not your account number, so something you know. Then you had to have a password, something you know. Then you had to have an extra phrase, something it was like three somethings you had to know. That's not three-factor authentication, that's one factor three times. So really what we're talking about is being able to get pick two or even three, possibly four out of your authentication factors. So, for example, when I worked in the military in a highly secure environment, I had to do three-factor authentication to get into my office. I guess technically four, because if I weren't physically there, I couldn't get in the building because I couldn't virtually come in, but go to the front door and swipe my card, beep, put it in there, and I go through a little man trap, which means you can't just walk through unless that's authenticated. I said, what happens if the power failure is halfway? And it never did, so it's fine. But then I get down to the secure area, and not only do you put your card in there and enter your PIN, but then you had to have a fingerprint. Okay, three-factor authentication. And then in you go, and you're in a place that has some very sensitive information. And we were quite comfortable with that. But from a user perspective, that multi-factor authentication, it comes down to usability. So quick bit of history says back in the year 2000, I was on board USS Coronado, which was a flagship for the U.S. Third Fleet. And what had happened was that in most ships that would have a communication center, in this case, a secure area, you would have what you call a little cipher lock. You put your hand, you got 5 buttons that go up or down. So I could say 3179, 2218, whatever. You just click in and you go. This lieutenant had me. He said, "Hey, sir, let me show you something." And they had set up a little eyeball scanner. A little thing said, "Look in here." A little blue light comes on and it says, "Identity verified. Authorization approved." And you hear ka-chong and the door would unlock. And this is pretty cool. How many ships have we got this on? Because I've been out for a while. And he said, "Just one, this experimental." I said, "How's it working?" He says, "Nobody uses it." I said, "What do you mean nobody uses it?" He says, "It takes about 4 seconds from identity verified as compared to about 3/4 of a second to go click in. And to save those extra 3 seconds, because you're always running around, nobody used that." So the usability becomes a huge factor when you go to multi-factor authentication and things such as that. So what we want to think then is, how do we make this comfortable for the user? So I think one of the very first things we used to have was the SMS. Okay, you get a cell phone message and it says, "Hey, here is your text." What are some of the other more common ways that were used for authentication? And then we're going to talk a little bit about which ones might have problems, which might not. But if we're sitting there as a CISOs thinking about what's in our toolbox, what could we put in there? Obviously, passwords are there, yeah, for better or worse. SMS is there for better or worse. What else can we use?
As you said, the key there was everybody trying to go to, what do I have available in the toolkit that I can leverage? And so you have somebody's phone number, you send them the OTP, a one-time code by SMS. Same way, you can send the same thing by email. The email thing evolved into this thing called magic links, which is, I'll send you a link. You click on it. That proves that you have access to the email and you can now get in. If you've ever dealt with a little card with a printed set of numbers provided to you that you had to then, every time you're logging in, pull out of your wallet, and it would ask you, enter the number in row 3, column 5, followed by, and it was a little game. And again, it comes back to, wait, what if I don't have my wallet on me? Or what if the card gets worn out? Or and as you said, it also takes way too much time. Those really used to be the ways, if you're in the workforce, or if you ever, I remember I used to have this back when I think E-Trade used to have it. They would send you like the RSA key,
Yeah.
the authenticator tag,
Used
which
to be
had the
Security
little,
Dynamics was the
yeah,
original
exactly.
vendor of that. I remember back in the 80s when they created that. And it would just had algorithm, and you give it a seed, and it would just go through. And as long as the computer that you're talking to had that same seed, you could predict it, and you would stay in sequence. Quick fun story if you're into old stories. So this would have been back around 1986 or so when they had it set up on one of the companies. It was running on the mainframe, and everybody had that. Third shift, spring forward, fall back. It's spring. They turn the clock ahead on the mainframe, and guess what? All your tokens are an hour behind, and they couldn't get into the mainframe. They had to go ahead and get a hold of the company to create a special software that would run ahead in the future an hour. And then after that, they went to what they call the ACE server, which is its own separate server where they could control the clock. We learn our lessons over time. And it's fun thinking about where we came from to get where we are now. What are some of the things about MFA that maybe the legacy MFA that could create a false sense of security that we think we're doing it right, but we're really not?
So I think really where it boils down to is MFA, just like passwords, all boil down to both sides having the same shared knowledge, and you're proving your authenticity to the other side by providing the same shared secret that the other side also has access to, that they can verify. You say horse, I say I know it's supposed to be horse, and therefore you're authenticated. The challenge is it is a based on me as the person that is trying to verify you, the server, having to securely store and save that same secret that you have. It also relies on you saving it and or knowing it securely, and it relies on transmission. You have to provide it. You have to enter it into a form. And that is the root of all phishing attacks, right? Phishing attacks rely on the fact that you have to enter that secret in an unencrypted, unprotected form in plain text into a form and provide it to me for it to be transmitted over to the other side. And it doesn't really matter whether it's a password, an OTP you receive via SMS, a code you're entering from the little key or your Google Authenticator app. They all have that same problem, which is if you can intercept it on the way, you can now leverage it to break in.
And the interception isn't necessarily a man in the middle. It could be just luring you over to a lookalike. Oh, I think that I'm authenticating. We see these all the time where you think you're logging into Microsoft, you think you're logging into, but if you look carefully, you're not at Microsoft.com, you're at evil.ru or something like that and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
there's a danger there. If the user has to go ahead and enter some value into a system, the average user might not be validating that they're actually communicating with the absolutely correct endpoint, at which point either man in the middle or they could get peeled off and they could get that way. So let's talk a little bit about FIDO, and let's talk, what's your approach? What does this FIDO Alliance recommend? What's our technology that actually acts as a fix for all of this?
I mentioned earlier that it was based on cryptography, but really, when we set out to solve the challenge of getting rid of passwords, the one key design goal there was it cannot be susceptible to phishing attacks. We had to make it phishing resistant. And that is where we relied on, instead of shared secrets, going to asymmetric cryptography and using the fact that we've always had asymmetric cryptography.
Say that fast 5 times, right?
Exactly. Asymmetric cryptography as a way of proving connections without both sides having to have the same secret, but rather having me having a private key and you having a public key. And that proof point that I can prove to you that I have the private key without actually having to send my private key anywhere is at the core of all the FIDO protocols. So the FIDO protocol started with something called UAF, or Universal Authentication Factor. They then evolved it into U2F, which was Universal Second Factor. And eventually those all came together in what is now called the FIDO 2 protocols. And they all rely on this core concept, which is that me as the party that has to authenticate, I have a private key, and the server that I'm authenticating to has the public key, and I authenticate by proving to the public key to the server that I am in possession of the private key without ever having to send any secrets that can be replayed, or doing it each time with some randomness built into it, such that if somebody even were to try and capture the data transmission in the middle, they can never use it a second time. It can never be used again to authenticate.
So for most of us know about crypto, real quickly though, a symmetric key would be something where I have the secret and you have a secret. And if I say, here's my password, you compare it to the password. Great. What happens if we say someone's going to intercept that? Then I hash the password and I compare the hash to the hash. That's okay, but you can't undo a hash because it's a one-way lossy compression. Well, we do the asymmetric cryptography, which really dates back to 1976 with Whit Diffie and Marty Hellman's paper. Although Clifford Cox had done some stuff in 74, but let's forget about the antecedents for that when somebody could actually talk about it in public. The whole idea is what? That I could go ahead and create a pair of values, a public and a private key, such that this key would encrypt, but only decrypt with that, and this key, there's my turn, would encrypt, but this could only decrypt over there. So in a way, it's like having a box in a box where I have a key where I could unlock the outer box and I could put something in it and close it. All right, in the inner box, I could go ahead and somebody else would have access to that key. And whatever you use to help explain to executives, the one thing that always seemed to be a bit of a challenge was the idea of the public key infrastructure, the PKI. I gave a talk at InfoSec World in 2000 called PK Don't Think So, where I said that one of the things that's really missing is the whole concept of a trusted set of certificate authorities, where somebody not only says, hey, I got a key, you got a key. How do I know this is really the right thing? And how do I know you're a legitimate customer if you just show up and say, I have a private key? Is there a concept of a CA in the FIDO Alliance? And if so, how do I register these keys in such a way that they're trusted? And does my browser have that built into my list of trusted certificate authorities? Or am I going in completely the wrong direction here?
Yeah, so it doesn't rely on public certificate chains in the same sense, like the way we do with browsers, because that's meant for an open internet, right? The concept in FIDO is I create individual public-private key pairs for each service that I'm going to be at. So going back to my example, if I log into 200 services at any time, in theory, I will have at least 200 private keys that I have to hold. Each of those services will have the corresponding pair that belongs to them. No sharing, nobody has the same keys, there's no requirement there. And it's individualized to each service. So there is no need for a certificate authority. The browser doesn't need to be involved in the sense that the browser doesn't have to validate this in any way, shape, or form. It's just, in this case, the browser is just acting as the intermediary in the middle. But it doesn't need to know anything about it in terms of what the keys are or how they're being leveraged. It just needs to know, how do I connect or facilitate the user leveraging and using their private key?
Okay, because I was just working on a project this morning using one of the tools it's using for DNS filtering and things like that. And you have to register within the browser the CA that comes from that company. Why? Because they will roll a certificate on the fly saying, hey, you wanted to go to abc.com. I'm going to intercept that and give you what appears to be abc.com. And you'll agree that, hey, I trust that root certificate, but the reality is I got to decrypt it, look at it, and then create the outside. So I could be a legitimate man in the middle there. But the whole idea with doing this key exchange when you're on the web is that if you go directly to the end and there's a certificate authority, you're not going to get the man in the middle presence. Mathematically, it can't happen. But with FIDO, what you're doing is I am creating these things, if you will, locally in my own little ecosystem. I'm not just throwing the door open saying, hey, anybody want to play FIDO with me? But if I an enterprise CISO or I want to create that for my environment, I can do it. And in doing so, I have the confidence that nobody else is going to be able to get into this system, and my users don't have to remember passwords. Now, when it comes time to go to one of these services and things like that, do I go to a software-based credential manager? Do I need a hardware-based key? Which of those are both available? And if so, what are the advantages and disadvantages of those?
Yeah, so as the end user, you are going back to that idea of, I have 200 private keys. A private key is not something you're going to remember. So you need something to hold those private keys for you. And really, that's where one of the things that we've evolved over time is this notion of, how do you manage your private keys as an individual? Because that was always the biggest challenge in
Right.
how to make PKI real and mass market, is you need something to manage that for you. But the good thing is, as tech evolved, that option opened up because we all started to get smartphones. So with the smartphone, you now have a device in your hand where you can save these private keys securely and confidently, and that you always have with you pretty much every single. It's hard to find a time when you don't have your smartphone right next to you at any point in time at this point. So you have the ability to now have passkeys stored on your smartphone, or you can have them on what are called security keys, right? If anybody's seen a YubiKey is just a hardware-based version of that. Exactly.
And
So
by the way, I have my little USB-C to A to C adapter. This is, I keep at the end of my YubiKey because you never like, oh, wait a minute, that port's taken. And yeah, they're surprisingly rugged and durable. I've been carrying this thing around for quite a while. And as a global administrator for some of my tenants, it's like, absolutely, I insist on this because there's no way I could be phished out of my password because the other person, no matter what they try to get out of me, they can't put the key in and make it work.
exactly. We now have both hardware-based mechanisms, we have essentially different kinds of passkeys now. So we have what are called device-bound passkeys, which is where we started, which is you create the private key on a device and it stays on that device. So B is an example of that, where a security key, the private key is in that hardware key and it cannot be exported. You cannot get the private key out of it because it is leveraging secure hardware for that purpose. And you can do that same thing in um, software authenticators on smartphones, primarily for workforce scenarios. And then you have something called synced passkeys. And synced passkeys, which is the most recent but the most important innovation in really driving passkeys adoption, is the idea of that the passkeys are stored in what is called a credential manager, and that credential manager is responsible for securely saving it. But the credential manager also makes sure that it's not something that you lose when you lose your device. So if you're carrying that YubiKey around, if you happen to lose that YubiKey, your keys are gone because there is no replacement for it. And in typical scenarios, what you suggest is make sure you register multiple YubiKeys so that you have a primary and a backup. With synced passkeys, you now have a credential manager that can be backed up and made available on all your devices. So that enables not just secure backup so that if I lose my smartphone, I can always still get back in, but it also enables the ability to have a passkey be available to me on all my devices. So whether I'm on my iPhone or my Microsoft laptop or my Google tablet, I can use the same passkey on all of them to access the same services because my credential manager is making sure it's the same passkey is available on all of them through a secure environment, through a secure mechanism behind the scenes.
Yeah, so the security guy in me is already trying to dream up a way to hack it. I'm sure you've already thought of that. Okay, someone leaves your phone around. I look at the little grease pattern on it. I said, it looks like someone does. Yeah, and I've done this before. I've won, did it for a beer or something like that at the bar. I said, I can open your phone. Watch this. So I'm into somebody's phone. Could I now at this point be them, invoke that whole store of passkeys and empty out everything everywhere? Or what's to keep me, if I get a hold of this device that's logged in, from becoming a terrible threat?
Yeah. So I think one of the key things to remember is the design of passkeys is really to prevent phishing attacks. It is built around the
Mhm.
concept of the most common attack vector is a remote attack vector, phishing attacks, etc. The bar to actually show up and physically grab your phone from your desk is significant, right? And that is not really the attack vector that you're looking for. If that is an actual attack vector that you are concerned about, and this is obviously not something to be ignored, that's where using something like a hardware key is
Mhm.
more appropriate, which you can lock in a safe or leave behind. And then you can back it up with additional factors as well.
And
Like
that's a very
so,
good point. Is that I want to make sure that we understand that we're solving a class of problem. We're not solving world hunger in this particular case. And again, if you're going to go with a YubiKey, you can password or put a pin on that YubiKey. So it's not just a bearer instrument. I have to plug it in,
yeah.
enter in a code, and then touch it. What's the whole idea about touching it at the end? Why do I do that? Just to make sure that my fingers aren't cold, or
So the main reason for that is to essentially verify the presence of the user. That you don't have it plugged in and then it's just being used because somebody
yeah.
landed up on a website and it just gets used. You're basically, essentially, if you think about it in different contexts, what you're getting is consent from the user. The user is saying, yes, log me in. I want to log in. So it's basically the way of verifying the user's presence. And within passive, you actually have different security levels. There you have presence, which is just simply, I want to touch. Then there's user verification, which is it is me who is touching. And that's where you have to now add a second factor like a PIN or as is now showing up, increasingly biometric security keys, where the key itself has a fingerprint reader built into it in many cases. And you now are not just needing to have the key in your possession, but also provide the biometric as well.
So if I roll this out, I got FIDO2 throughout my enterprise. Hey, we're good. Now a new employee walks in the door Monday morning. Hi, I'm new here. How do I bootstrap them without having to say, here's your temporary password that Microsoft has generated. Log in with that, change it to something more. It seems like there's a window of vulnerability there. But have we figured out a way to collapse and get rid of that so a person can walk in the door and when I start giving them access, I'm really doing it securely? How would that work?
Yeah, so the account bootstrap process really is one of the most important pieces. The other one to actually think about is account recovery. So they both are essentially at the end of the day two sides of the same problem, which is, as you pointed out, those are the points that are in essence the most vulnerable. You want to establish a passkey after you have strongly verified the identity of the user who is setting up the passkey. So in workforce environments, that is typically tied to some form of you're in the office and you can verify the person's identity before you allow them to set up a passkey. It's very similar to how if you've ever had to go to a bank and open an account, they make you sit at the desk and they literally turn the monitor around to you and give you the keyboard and say, type in your password, because the agent or who is sitting there has done the check before allowing you to enter your password. We have a number of different options there available to depending on the use case, right? So in the workforce scenario, you typically time it to some sort of workforce onboarding with, especially for things like security keys, there are ways and services that where they can actually precede the security key and ship it out to your house where it is already tied to the account that they may have created for you, right? So if you're a new employee, as part of the onboarding, they may have, an admin may have said, okay, Nishant's going to be joining as a new employee on the 15th. Please create a security key for him. Give me the right identifiers and information about the specific security key that I'm linking to their account, and ship them that specific security key. So there is that mechanism as available. There's also things you can do with identity verification. One of the things the FIDO Alliance does is defines security requirements and standards and certification around things like document authenticity checks through the typical scan a document, take a selfie, use biometrics to verify it before you allow somebody to do whatever, account open, account recovery, etc. So you can use those mechanisms as a way of tying it into the passkey as well. So there's multiple ways, but it is really one of the most important things to think about when thinking about passkeys, technically speaking, about any authentication that factor, if you will. You don't even have to be doing passkeys to think about account opening and account recovery being the most vulnerable points in the chain.
And agree with you. And I think we've seen over the last couple of years some cases where workers from like Democratic People's Republic of Korea have been able to successfully use deepfake software to come across as a white middle-aged American male and get hired remotely, and they ship off the laptop and things like that. And you get somebody on. It used to be put your hand in front of your face or hold up a coffee cup, or I don't have a coffee cup with me, I got a water glass, but the AI is getting better, and it's getting to the point where that doesn't do. Is there anything FIDO can do for us at that point where we're onboarding something that gives us a higher level of assurance, or is that also outside of the problem set that we're trying to solve here?
So it is one of the areas that FIDO is involved in. One of the ways we do that is, as I mentioned, we have security requirements and certifications for products that deal with identity verification, whether it's the doc authenticity and biometric pieces. And when you think about the attack vector you described, which is somebody trying to do a remote verification using deepfakes, the way you use deepfakes is by something called an injection attack, where essentially you're taking over the camera. And so the input in the Zoom session or in the app that is using isn't actually coming from the camera itself, but you've bypassed it to have some piece of software that is generating the deepfake inject the video stream
Kind
into
of a
it.
man in the middle, if you will, on the, but it's a
Exactly.
machine in the middle. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. And so that's really how deepfakes work. Deepfakes are not like creating synthetic prosthetics and things like that that you're putting on, right? So the way to tackle that is by what is called injection attack detection. You're basically looking for mechanisms to both prevent that kind of mechanism from taking over the camera or taking over the video stream and injecting a fake stream into that. So that's really what we do. And so again, that is one of the aspects of the certification process that we are, since this is relatively new, currently in the process of defining requirements around to essentially up-level what we call our biometric liveness detection piece, right? Which is
Mhm.
a key element of essentially biometric liveness is I want to make sure that the person presenting the biometric is real and is the actual person. And so this falls within that category of protection. So we have that. Another stream that is emerging that will eventually help with this is this notion of digital credentials. So digital credentials is the idea that rather than having to present a document that you have to take a picture of and upload or you capturing with the camera, which again is subject to, it's much easier to create a fake document now, right? Especially with AI, but fake documents have been a problem for a long time. But now we're getting into this phase of mobile documents, right? We're getting, whether it's mobile driver's licenses or you have passports with biometric chips and them, NFC chips and stuff like that. You can use these things that essentially are cryptographically signed documents that you can present as a proof rather than a piece of plastic or a paper. And those are much easier to validate, much harder to fake. And those have certificate authorities where you can say, okay, this is a mobile driver's license. It's signed by New Jersey or it's signed by
Mhm.
California. I can validate that, and therefore I can trust the data that's on it and the image that's on it.
Yeah, I'm up here in, for example, Washington, D.C., and I rode the MARC train this morning. And so instead of buying a paper ticket, I just download the app and I go ahead and get on the train. You click, okay, activate your ticket. And then it gives you like the equivalent of a barcode. Now, I've seen some places where or the QR code, but I've seen some places where that will be dynamic and it keeps changing and changing. Why? Because if you just did a screenshot from the last time I took the train, and then the guy's okay, wait a minute, it doesn't scan because it's you're embedded something that says, hey, you've activated at this date, this time. It's good for so many minutes. And that's now embedded into that token. But I can see one where it keeps dynamically changing so that you can't take a screenshot or lift a screenshot. So there's all these great ideas. And then, of course, as you were mentioning a little bit about sort of hardware based attestation, if I know that this device, let's say, can register this particular cell phone saying, I trust it. And the operating system has its own integrity checks in it, so it can tell whether or not that it's been rooted or whether it's been jailbroken. And so if I can say, if you can prove you've not been jailbroken, and I can prove the pathway from the camera to the data stream that I'm getting has not been tampered with based upon what the OS tells me, there's a pretty good chance there's not a deepfake going on.
Yep.
And so all these great ideas are working really well from us from an enterprise perspective to do stuff. Now, if we think about things, are stuff like legislation, regulations, like the Cyber Resilience Act up in Europe, is that actually mandating any of this? Are you guys way out ahead of the government agencies? Or are they following you saying, this FIDO Alliance has got a good idea? Maybe we'll write that into code.
Yeah. So regulation tends to get tricky and very, as well as culturally region specific, right? Regulation is a very region specific thing. Just think about think about the difference between the US that will never have a national identity versus countries like Japan that have a national identity. You have to deal with these nuances. But regulation, by and large, across the world, is recognizing this challenge because they see just the impact on fraud, and so they have all been updating themselves to keep up the pace. And I think there's a greater urgency now. But again, it that cultural thing means that in some cases they're much more prescriptive and demanding about you must. And as we strongly advise that you do this. For example, in the US, NIST has been doing an excellent job in updating the regulation, not the regulation, the guidance. NIST 863-4, really strong in recommendations about please go away from passwords. Please start using phishing-resistant authentication, including passkeys, etc. And obviously, in the US, a lot of agencies and even businesses look at the NIST guidance as the blueprint, as the benchmark. You go to other regulatory authorities; they are now introducing strong regulation that says if you're using SMS OTP, stop. SMS OTP is in violation of the regulation. So if you're a bank or if you're or a sensitive, especially regulated industries, If you're using SMS OTPs, you have a short amount of time to phase that out. We've seen that with the EU digital wallet initiatives in Europe as well. So I think regulations are recognizing this and are catching up pretty swiftly. Tech obviously goes much faster. I think the urgency is clearly there, as you can see with all the AI regulations that are starting to be debated very hotly across the globe, I would say.
Got it. Hey, as we're getting close to the end of the show, let's take one last question I have. From your experience, what mistake have you seen often made by CISOs or security folks that they get wrong when they're trying to go passwordless so that we can give people a warning of what not to do if you see this happen on a regular basis?
So I think if I think about it from an implementation side of it, the number one thing that folks are making mistake with is not paying attention to their account recovery flows. Because as a good friend of mine puts it, an account recovery flow is just another authentication flow. And there is no point in having multiple authentication flows where you've really locked down one and made it super hard to break, and then left this other one that is really easy to exploit, right? So yeah, I go to passwordless, phishing-resistant authentication on my main authentication flow, but my account recovery is still reliant on email you an OTP and you just enter it on this form and you can get back in. That's where all the attackers are going to go, right? They're going to ignore the front door and they're going to all head to the back door. So really, the number one recommendation is as you go on your passwordless journey, you must pay attention to account recovery and the account recovery flows you have. That's the main one.
Excellent. So, of course, anybody wants to know a bit more about this, they can go to fidoalliance.org and they can learn about it. They can engage in their own effort to go ahead and finally get us away from this original sin of passwords and getting us into a passwordless environment where we don't have to worry so much anymore about users being phished from their credentials. And therefore, our new perimeter identity is much more secure. Nishant, thank you so much for taking the time to be on here, the Chief Technology Officer over at the FIDO Alliance, and you brought us some wonderful insights. If you're a regular listener or follower of CISO Tradecraft, I thank you. And if you're new for the first time, don't forget to follow us and become part of our team and help other people find where we are as well. We also have a Substack newsletter and also a LinkedIn presence where we put out a little bit more than just the podcast. We give you a regular stream of what we think is high quality information that can help you with your cybersecurity career journey. So thank you again for being part of the audience. Thank you again, Nishant, for being part of the show. This is your host, G. Mark Hardy. And until next time, stay safe out there.